Chapter 7 of Women on the American Frontier. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Women on the American Frontier, by William W. Fowler. Chapter 7. Moving West. Perils of the Journey. In regarding or in enjoying an end already accomplished by others, we are too apt to pass by the means through which that end was reached. America of to-day represents a grand result. We see that our land is great, rich, and powerful. We see that the flag waves from ocean to ocean, over a people furnished with all the appliances of civilization, and happy in their enjoyment. We are conscious that all this has come from the toils and the sufferings of many men and of many women who have lived and loved before us, and passed away, leaving behind them their country growing greater and richer, happier and more powerful, for what they have borne and done. But our view of the means by which that mighty end was reached are apt to be altogether too vague and general. While we are enjoying what others have worked to attain, let us not selfishly and forgetfully pass by the toils, the struggles, the firm endurance of those who went before us and accomplished this vast aggregate of results. Each stage in the process by which these results were wrought out had its peculiar trials, its special service. Looking back to that far-off past, and in the light of our own knowledge and conceptions, we find it almost impossible to decide which stage was encompassed with the deadliest dangers, the severest labors, the keenest sorrows, the largest list of discomforts. But certainly to woman, the breaking up of her eastern home and the removal to the far west was not the least burdensome and trying. No characteristic of woman is more remarkable than the strength of her local associations and attachments. In making the home she learns to love it, and this feeling seems to be often strongest when the surroundings are the bleakest, the rudest, and the most comfortless. The Highlander and the Switzer pine amid the luxuriant scenes of tropical life, when their thoughts revert to the smoky Shih Ling or to the rocking compass chalet of their far-off mountains. Such, too, doubtless, was the clinging fondness with which the women regarded their rude cabins on the frontier of the Atlantic States. They had toiled and fought to make these rude abodes the homes for those dearest to them. Here children, the firstborn of the Republic, had been nurtured. Here, too, were the graves of the first fathers and mothers of America. Humble and comfortless as those dwelling places would have seemed to the men and women of to-day, they were dear to the wives and mothers of colonial times. Comprehending as we may this feeling, and knowing the peculiar difficulties of long journeys in those days, into a wild and hostile country, we can understand why the westward march of emigration and settlement was so slow during the first 150 or 60 years of our history. New England had, it is true, been largely subjugated and reclaimed. A considerable body of emigrants, wedge-like, were driving slowly up through the Mohawk Valley towards Niagara. A weak, thin line was straggling with difficulty across the Alleghanies in Pennsylvania, towards the Ohio, and a more compact and confident battalion in Virginia was pushing into Kentucky. But how scattered and feeble that picket line compared to the army which was soon to follow it! For a season, and while the British were trying to force their yoke on the reluctant colonists, the westward movement had a check. The danger was in the rear. His old home in the East was threatened, and the pioneer turned about and faced the rising sun, until the danger was past and he could pursue his journey. The close of the Revolutionary struggle gave a new impulse to the westward march of the American people, which had been arrested for the time being by the War of Independence. The patriot soldiers found themselves, upon the advent of peace, impoverished in fortune, but with high hopes and stout hearts they immediately set about repairing the ravages of the long war. Nurtured in the rugged school of danger and hardship, they had ceased to regard the West with dread. Curiosity, blended with the hope of bettering their condition, turned their faces to that fresh, unbounded, magnificent wilderness. Accustomed to camp life and seasons of exciting interest, the humdrum days at the old homestead became distasteful. The West was the hunter's paradise. The toil held beneath it the potency of harvests of extraordinary richness, and the soldier who had faced the disciplined battalions of Great Britain recked little of the prowling red man. During the Revolution, the women, left alone by their husbands and fathers, who were with the army, were more than ever thrown on their own resources. They tilled the farm, reared their swarthy and nimble broods of children, and sent the boys in blue and buff all they could spare from their slender store. During all this trying period they were fitting themselves for that new life in the western wilds which had been marked out for them by the hand of an overruling Providence. And yet, hard and lonely as the lives of these devoted women must have been in their eastern homes, and bright as their imaginations may have pictured the richness of the West, it must have given them many a pang when the husband and father told them that the whole family must be removed at once from their beloved homestead, which they or their fathers had redeemed from the wilderness after so many years of toil. We may imagine the resolution that was required to break up the old attachments which bind women to their homes and firesides. It must have required a heroic courage to do this for the purpose of seeking a new home not only among strangers but among wild beasts and savages. But the fathers and mothers 100 years ago possessed a spirit which rose above the perils of their times. They went forward, unhesitatingly, in their long and toilsome journeys westward, driving their slow-footed oxen and lumbering wagons hundreds of miles, over ground where no road was, through woods infested with bears and wolves, panthers and warlike tribes of Indians, settling in the midst of those dangerous enemies, and conquering them all. The army of pioneers, like the skirmishers who had preceded them, moved forward in 3 columns. The northernmost passed through New York State, the middle column moved westward through Pennsylvania, the southernmost marched through Virginia. Within 10 years after the Treaty of Versailles, the 3 columns had met in Ohio and Kentucky, and spreading out over that beautiful region, were fighting with nature and savage men to subjugate both and bring them within the bounds of civilization. No more sublime spectacle has ever greeted the eye of the historian than the march of that army. 20,000 or 30,000 men and women, bearing, like the Israelites of old, their ark across the desert and waste places, that ark which bore the blessings of civilization and religion within its holy shrine. Aged matrons, nursing mothers, prattling infants, hoary patriarchs, and strong veterans fresh from the fields of their country's glory, marching to form a mighty empire in the wilderness. In this present age of rapid and easy transition from place to place, it is difficult to form a just conception of the tediousness, hardships, and duration of those early emigrations to the West. The difference in conveyance is that between a train of cars drawn by a 40-ton locomotive and a 2-horse wagon without springs and of the most lumbering and primitive construction. This latter was the best conveyance that the emigrant could command. A few were so fortunately situated on the banks of rivers that they could float down with the current in flatboats while their cattle were being driven along the shore, or if it was necessary to ascend towards the headwaters of a river, they could work their way upstream with setting poles. But most of the emigrants traveled with teams. Some of those who went part of the way in boats had to begin or end their journey in wagons. The vehicles which they provided on such occasions for land carriage were curiosities of wheelcraft. I speak of the Jersey wagons. The old-fashioned Jersey wagon has, years ago, given place to more showy and flexible vehicles. But long before such were invented the Jersey wagon was an established institution, and was handed down, with the family name, from father to son. It was the great original of the modern emigrant wagon of the West. But as I have elsewhere pictured its appearance upon the arrival of a band of pioneers at their final destination, it is unnecessary to enter here upon any further description. The spring of the year was the season usually selected for moving, and during many weeks previous to the appointed time the emigrants had been actively providing against the accidents and discomforts of the road. When all was ready, the wagon was loaded, the oxen yoked and hooked to the neap. The women and children took their places on the summit of the huge load, the baby in its mother's lap, the youngest boy at his grandmother's feet, and off they started. The largest boy walked beside and drove the team; the other boys drove the cows; the men trudged behind or ahead, and the whole cavalcade passed out of the great gate, the grandmother peering through her spectacles, and the mother smiling through her tears, and looking back more than once at the home which she had made but was now to leave forever. In this manner the early emigrants went forward, driving their heavily laden wagon by day and sleeping at night by the camp. After they had passed the region of roads and bridges, they had to literally hew their way, cutting down bushes, prying their wagon out of bog holes, building bridges, or pulling themselves across streams on rafts. But in defiance of every obstacle, they pressed forward. Neither rivers nor mountains stayed the course of the emigrant. Guiding his course by the sun and ever facing west, he went slowly on. When that luminary set, his parting rays lit the faces of the pioneer family, and when it rose it threw their long shadows before them on the soft spongy turf of the forest glades. Sweating through the undergrowth, climbing over fallen trees, sinking knee-deep in marshes, at noon they halted to take a rest in the shade of the primeval forest, beside a brook, and there eat their midday meal of fried pork and corn cakes, which the woman prepared, then on again till the shadows stretched far back toward their old homes. Sometimes a storm burst upon them, and the women and children huddled beneath the cart as the thunderbolts fell, shivering the huge trunks of the forest monarchs, and the lightning crimsoned the faces of the forlorn party with its glare. Then the heavens cleared, the sun came out, and the ox cart went rumbling and creaking onward. No doubt the first days of that weary tramp had in them something of pleasurable excitement. The breezes of spring fanned the brows of the wayfarers, and told of the health and freedom of woodland life, the magnificence of the forest, the summits of the mountains tinged with blue, the sparkling waters of lake and stream, must have given joy to even the most stolid of those households. But emotions of this description soon became strangers to their souls. But the emigrants ere long found that the wilderness had lost the charms of novelty. Sights and sounds that were at first pleasing, and had lessened the sense of discomfort, soon ceased to attract attention. Their minds, solely occupied with obstacles, inconveniences, and obstructions, at every step of the way, became sullen, or, at least, indifferent. To the toils and discomforts incident to their journey were often added casualties and great personal risks. An unlucky step might wrench an ankle, the axe might glance from a twig and split a foot open, and a broken leg or a severed artery is a frightful thing where no surgeon can be had. Exposure to all the changes of the weather, sleeping upon the damp ground, frequently brought on fevers, and sickness, at all times a great calamity, was infinitely more so to the pioneer. It must have been appalling in the woods. Many a mother has carried her wailing, languishing child in her arms to lessen the jolting of the wagon, without being able to render it the necessary assistance. Many a family has paused on the way to gather a leafy couch for a dying brother or sister. Many a parent has laid in the grave, in the lonely wilderness, the child they should meet no more till the morning of the resurrection. Many a heart at the West has yearned at the thought of the treasured one resting beneath the spreading tree. Aftercomers have stopped over the little mound, and pondered upon the rude memorial carved in the bark above it, and those who had sustained a similar loss have wrung their hands and wept over it, for their own wounds were opened afresh. Among the chapters of accident and casualty which make up the respective diaries of the families who left their eastern homes after the Revolution and joined the ranks of the western emigrants, there is none more interesting than that of Mrs. Jameson. She was the child of wealthy parents, and had been reared in luxury in the city of New York. Soon after peace was declared she was married to Edward Jameson, a brave soldier in the war, who had nothing but his stout arms and intrepid heart to battle with the difficulties of life. Her father, dying soon after, his estate was discovered to have been greatly lessened by the depreciation in value which the war had produced. Gathering together the remains of what was once a large fortune, the couple purchased the usual outfit of the emigrants of that period and set out to seek their fortunes in the West. All went well with them until they reached the Allegheny River, which they undertook to cross on a raft. It was the month of May. The river had been swollen by rains, and when they reached the middle of the stream, the part of the raft on which Mr. Jameson sat became detached, the logs separated, and he sank to rise no more. The other section of the raft, containing Mrs. Jameson, her babe of 8 months, and a chest of clothing and household gear, floated down stream at the mercy of the rapid current. Bracing herself against the shock, Mrs. Jameson managed to paddle to the side of the river from which she had just before started. She was landed nearly a mile below the point where had been left the cattle, and also the ox cart in which their journey had been hitherto performed, and which her husband expected to carry over the river on the raft, returning for them as soon as his wife and babe had been safely landed on the western bank. The desolate mother succeeded in mooring the remains of the raft to the shore, then clasping her babe to her bosom, followed the bank of the river till she reached the oxen and cart, which she drove down to the place where she landed, and by great exertions succeeded in hauling the chest upon the bank. Her strength was now exhausted, and lying down in the bottom of the cart, she gave way to grief and despair. Her situation may be easily imagined. Alone in the forest, 30 miles from the nearest settlement, her husband torn from her in a moment, and her babe smiling as though he would console his mother for her terrible loss. In her sad condition, self-preservation would have been too feeble a motive to impel her to make any further effort to save herself, but maternal love, the strongest instinct in a woman's heart, buoyed her up and stimulated her to unwonted exertions. The spot where she found herself was a dense forest, stretching back to a rocky ledge on the east, and terminated on the north by an alluvial meadow nearly bare of trees. Along the banks of the river was a thick line of high bushes and saplings, which served as a screen against the observations of savages passing up and down the river in their canoes. The woods were just bursting into leaf, the spring flowers filled the air with odor, and checkered the green foliage and grass. The whole scene was full of vernal freshness, life, and beauty. The track which the Jamesons had followed was about midway between the northern and southern routes generally pursued by emigrants, and it was quite unlikely that others would cross the river at that point. The dense jungle that skirted the river bank was an impediment in the way of reaching the settlements lower down, and there was danger of being lost in the woods if the unfortunate woman should start alone. "On this spot," she said, "I must remain till some one comes to my help." The first 2 years of her married life had been spent on a farm in Westchester County, New York, where she had acquired some knowledge of farming and woodcraft by assisting her husband in his labors, or by accompanying him while hunting and fishing. She was strong and healthy, and quite unlike her delicate sisters of modern days, her lithe frame was hardened by exercise in the open air, and her face was tinged by the kisses of the sun. Slowly recovering from the terrible anguish of her loss, she cast about for a shelter and sustenance. The woods were swarming with game, both large and small, from the deer to the rabbit, and from the wild turkey to the quail. The brooks were alive with trout. The meadow was well suited for Indian corn, wheat, rye, or potatoes. The forest was full of trees of every description. To utilize all these raw materials was her study. A rude hut, built of boughs interlaced, and covered thickly with leaves and dry swamp grass, was her first work. This was her kitchen. The cart, which was covered with canvas, was her sleeping room. A shotgun, which she had learned the use of, enabled her to keep herself supplied with game. She examined her store of provisions, consisting of pork, flour, and Indian meal, and made an estimate that they would last 8 months, with prudent use. The oxen she tethered at first, but afterwards tied the horns to one of their forefeet and let them roam. The 2 cows having calved soon after, she kept them near at hand by making a pen for the calves, who by their bleating called their mothers from the pastures on the banks of the river. In the meadow she planted 1/2 acre of corn and potatoes, which soon promised an amazing crop. Thus 2 months passed away. In her solitary and sad condition she was cheered by the daily hope that white settlers would cross her track or see her as they passed up and down the river. She often thought of trying to reach a settlement, but dreaded the dangers and difficulties of the way. Like the doe which hides her fawn in the secret covert, this young mother deemed herself and her babe safer in this solitude than in trying unknown perils, even with the chance of falling in with friends. She therefore contented herself with her lot, and when the toils of the day were over, she would sit on the bank and watch for voyagers on the river. Once she heard voices in the night on the river, and going to the banks she strained her eyes to gaze through the darkness and catch sight of the voyagers. But she dared not hail them, for fear they might be Indians, and soon the voices grew fainter in the distance, and she heard them no more. Again, while sitting in a clump of bushes on the bank one day, she saw with horror 6 canoes with Indians, apparently directing their course to the spot where she sat. They were hideously streaked with war paint, and came so near that she could see the scalping knives in their girdles. Turning their course as they approached the eastern shore, they silently paddled down stream, scanning the banks sharply as they floated past. Fortunately they saw nothing to attract their attention, the cart and hut being concealed by the dense bushes, and there being no fire burning. Fearing molestation from the Indians, she now moved her camp 100 rods back, near a rocky ledge, from the base of which flowed a spring of pure water. Here, by rolling stones in a circle, she made an enclosure for her cattle at night, and within it built a log cabin of rather frail construction. Another 2 weeks was consumed in these labors, and it was now the middle of August. At night she was at first much alarmed by the howling of wolves, who came sniffing round the cart where she slept. Once a large gray wolf put its paws upon the cart and poked its nose under the canvas covering, but a smart blow on the snout drove it yelping away. None of the cattle were attacked, owing to the bold front showed to these midnight intruders. The wolf is one of the most cowardly of wild beasts, and will rarely attack a human being, or even an ox, unless pressed by hunger, and in the winter. Often she caught glimpses of huge black bears in the swamps, while she was in pursuit of wild turkeys or other game, but these creatures never attacked her, and she gave them a wide berth. One hot day in August, she was gathering berries on the rocky ledge beside which her house was situated, when seeing a clump of bushes heavily loaded with the finest blackberries, she laid her babe upon the ground, and climbing up, soon filled her basket with the luscious fruit. As she descended, she saw her babe sitting upright and gazing with fixed eyeballs at some object near by, though what it was she could not clearly make out, on account of an intervening shrub. Hastening down, a sight met her eyes that froze her blood. An enormous rattlesnake was coiled within 3 feet of her child, and with its head erect and its forked tongue vibrating, its burning eyes were fixed upon those of the child, which sat motionless as a statue, apparently fascinated by the deadly gaze of the serpent. Seizing a stick of dry wood, she dealt the reptile a blow, but the stick being decayed and brittle, inflicted little injury on the serpent, and only caused it to turn itself towards Mrs. Jameson, and fix its keen and beautiful but malignant eyes steadily upon her. The witchery of the serpent's eyes so irresistibly rooted her to the ground, that for a moment she did not wish to remove from her formidable opponent. The huge reptile gradually and slowly uncoiled its body, all the while steadily keeping its eye fixed on its intended victim. Mrs. Jameson could only cry, being unable to move, "O God, preserve me! Save me, Heavenly Father!" The child, after the snake's charm was broken, crept to her mother, and buried its little head in her lap. We continue the story in Mrs. Jameson's own words. The snake now began to writhe its body down a fissure in the rock, keeping its head elevated more than a foot from the ground. Its rattle made very little noise. It every moment darted out its forked tongue, its eyes became reddish and inflamed, and it moved rather quicker than at first. It was now within 2 yards of me. By some means I had dissipated the charm, and roused by a sense of my awful danger, determined to stand on the defensive. To run away from it, I knew would be impracticable, as the snake would instantly dart its whole body after me. I therefore resolutely stood up, and put a strong glove on my right hand, which I happened to have with me. I stretched out my arm; the snake approached slowly and cautiously towards me, darting out its tongue still more frequently. I could now only recommend myself fervently to the protection of Heaven. The snake, when about a yard distant, made a violent spring. I quickly caught it in my right hand, directly under its head. It lashed its body on the ground, at the same time rattling loudly. I watched for an opportunity, and suddenly holding the animal's head, while for a moment it drew in its forked tongue, with my left hand I, by a violent contraction of all the muscles in my hand, contrived to close up effectually its jaws. Much was now done, but much more was to be done. I had avoided much danger, but I was still in very perilous circumstances. If I moved my right hand from its neck for a moment, the snake, by avoiding suffocation, could easily muster sufficient power to force its head out of my hand, and if I withdrew my hand from its jaws, I should be fatally in the power of its most dreaded fangs. I retained, therefore, my hold with both my hands. I drew its body between my feet, in order to aid the compression and hasten suffocation. Suddenly the snake, which had remained quiescent for a few moments, brought up its tail, hit me violently on the head, and then darted its body several times very tightly around my waist. Now was the very acme of my danger. Thinking, therefore, that I had sufficient power over its body, I removed my right hand from its neck, and in an instant drew my hunting knife. The snake, writhing furiously again, darted at me, but striking its body with the edge of the knife, I made a deep cut, and before it could recover its coil, I caught it again by the neck, bending its head on my knee, and again recommending myself fervently to Heaven. I cut its head from its body, throwing the head to a great distance. The blood spouted violently in my face, the snake compressed its body still tighter, and I thought I should be suffocated on the spot, and laid myself down. The snake again rattled its tail, and lashed my feet with it. Gradually, however, the creature relaxed its hold. Its coils fell slack around me, and untwisting it and throwing it from me as far as I was able, I sank down and swooned upon the bank. When consciousness returned, the scene appeared like a terrible dream, till I saw the dead body of my reptile foe, and my babe crying violently and nestling in my bosom. The ledge near which my cabin was built was infested with rattlesnakes, and the one I had slain seemed to be the patriarch of a numerous family. From that day I vowed vengeance against the whole tribe of reptiles. These creatures were in the habit of coming down to the spring to drink, and I sometimes killed 4 or 5 in a day. Before the summer was over, I made an end of the whole family. In September, 2 households of emigrants floating down the river on a flatboat, caught sight of Mrs. Jameson as she made a signal to them from the bank, and coming to land were pleased with the country, and were persuaded to settle there. The little community was now swelled to 15, including 4 women and 6 children. The colony throve, received accessions from the East, and surviving all casualties, grew at last into a populous town. Mrs. Jameson was married again to a stalwart backwoodsman, and became the mother of a large family. She was always known as the mother of the Alleghany settlement. Not a few of the pioneer women penetrated the West by means of boats. The lakes and the river Ohio were the watercourses by which the advance guard of the army of emigrants was enabled to reach the fertile regions adjacent thereto. This mode of travel, while free from many of the hindrances and hardships of the land routes, was subject to other casualties and dangers. Storms on the lakes, and snags and shoals on the rivers, often made the pioneers regret that they had left the forests for the waters. The banks of the rivers were infested with savages, who slaughtered and scalped the men, and carried the women and children into a captivity which was worse than death. The early annals of the West are full of the sad stories of such captivities, and of the women who took part in these terrible scenes. The following instances will be interesting to the reader. In the latter part of April, 1784, one Mr. Rowan, with his own and 5 other families, set out from Louisville, in 2 flat-bottomed boats, for the Long Falls of Green River. Their intention was to descend the Ohio to the mouth of Green River, then ascend that stream to their place of destination. At that time there were no settlements in Kentucky within 100 miles of Long Falls, afterwards called Vienna. Having driven their cattle upon one of the boats, they loaded the other with their household goods, farming implements, and stores. The latter was provided with covers under which the 6 families could sleep, with the exception of 3 of the men who took charge of the cattle boat. The first 3 days of their journey were passed in ease and gaiety. Floating with the current, and using the broad oars only to steer with, they kept their course in the main channel where there was little danger of shoals and snags. The weather was fine, and the scenery along the banks of the majestic river had that placid beauty that distinguishes the country through which the lower Ohio rolls its mighty mass of waters on their way to the Mississippi. These halcyon days of the voyage were destined, however, to be soon abruptly terminated. They had descended the river about 100 miles, gliding along in peace and fancied security. The women and children had retired to their bunks, and all of the men, except those who were steering the boat, were composing themselves to sleep, when suddenly the placid stillness of the night was broken by a fearful sound which came from the river far below them. The steersmen at first supposed it was the howling of wolves, but as they neared the spot from which the sound proceeded, on rounding a bend in the river, they saw the glare of fires in the darkness. The sounds at the same time redoubled in shrillness and volume, and they knew then that a large body of Indians were below them, and would almost inevitably discover their boats. The numerous fires on the Illinois shore, and the peculiar yells of the savages, led them to believe that a flatboat which preceded them had been captured, and that the Indians were engaged in their cruel orgies of torture and massacre. The 2 boats were immediately lashed together, and the best practical arrangements were made for defending them. The men were distributed by Mr. Rowan to the best advantage in case of an attack. They were 7 in number. The boats were neared to the Kentucky shore, keeping off from the bank lest there might be Indians on that shore also. When they glided by the uppermost fire, they entertained a faint hope that they might escape unperceived, but they were discovered when they had passed about half of the fires and commanded to halt. They, however, remained silent, for Mr. Rowan had given strict orders that no one should utter any sound but that of the rifle, and not that until the Indians should come within reach. The savages, united in a most terrific yell, rushed to their canoes and pursued them. They floated on in silence. Not an oar was pulled. The enemy approached the boats within 100 yards, with a seeming determination to board them. Just at this moment Mrs. Rowan rose from her seat, collected the axes and placed one by the side of each man, where he stood with his gun, touching him on the knee with the handle of the axe as she leaned it up beside him against the edge of the boat, to let him know it was there. She then retired to her seat, retaining a hatchet for herself. None but those who have had a practical acquaintance with Indian warfare can form a just idea of the terror which their hideous yelling is calculated to inspire. When heard that night in the mighty solitude through which those boats were passing, we are told that most of the voyagers were panic-stricken and almost nerveless until Mrs. Rowan's calm resolution and intrepidity inspired them with a portion of her own undaunted spirit. The Indians continued hovering on their rear and yelling for nearly 3 miles. When awed by the inference which they drew from the silence of the party in the boat, they relinquished farther pursuit. Woman's companionship and influence are nowhere more necessary than on the long and tedious journey of the pioneer to the West. Man is a born rover. He sails over perilous seas and beneath unfamiliar constellations. He penetrates the trackless forest and scales the mountains for gain or glory, or out of mere love of motion and adventure. A life away from the fetters and conventionalities of civilized society also has its charms to the manly heart, but it seems also to breed a spirit of unrest. "I will not stay here, whither shall I go?" Thus the spirit whispers to itself. motion, only motion! Onward, ever onward! The restless foot of the pioneer has reached and climbed the mountains. He pauses but a moment to gaze at the valley, and presses forward. The valley reached, and he must cross the river, and now the unbounded expanse of the plain spreads before him. Traversing this after many weary days, he stands beneath a mightier mountain range towering above him. Up, up, struggling upward but ever onward, he has reached the snowy summit, and gazes upon wider valleys, lit by a kinglier sun and spanned by kindlier skies, and far off he sees sparkling in the evening light another and grander ocean on whose shores he must pause. Thus, by various motives and impulses, the line which bounds the area of civilized society is constantly being extended. But all through this tumult of the mind and heart, through this rush of motion and life, there is heard another voice. Soft and penetrating, it sounds in the hour of calm and stillness, and tells of happiness and repose. As in the beautiful song, one word is its burden: home, home, sweet home, where the lonely heart and toil-worn feet may find rest. That voice must have its answer, that aspiration must be reached by the aid of woman. It is she, and only she, that makes the home. Around her as a beaming nucleus are attracted and gather the thousand lesser lights of the fireside. She is the central figure of the domestic group, and where she is not, there is no home. Man may explore a continent, subjugate nature and conquer savage races, but no permanent settlement can be made or any new empire formed without the alliance of woman. She must therefore be the companion of the restless rover on his westward march, in order that the secret cravings of his soul may be at last satisfied in that home of happiness and rest, which woman alone can form. Nothing will better illustrate the restless and indomitable spirit that inspires the western pioneer, and at the same time display the constant companionship and tireless energy of woman, than the singular history of a family named Moody. The emigrant ancestors of this family lived and died in eastern Massachusetts, where, after arriving from England in 1634, they first settled. In 1675, two of the daughters were living west of the Connecticut River. A granddaughter of the emigrant was settled near the New York boundary line in 1720. Her daughter, marrying a Dutch farmer of Schoharie, made her home in the valley of the Mohawk during the French and Indian Wars and the Revolution. In 1783, although an aged woman, she moved with her husband and family to Ohio, where she soon after died, leaving a daughter who married a Moody, a far-away cousin, and moved first into Indiana and finally into Illinois, where she and her husband died, leaving a son, J.G. Moody, who inherited the enterprising spirit of his predecessors, and marrying a female relative, who inherited the family name and spirit, before he was of age, resumed the family march towards the Pacific. The first place where the family halted was in the territory of Iowa. Here they lived for 10 years, tilling a noble farm on the Des Moines River. They then sold their house and land, and pushed 100 miles further westward. Here again new toils and triumphs awaited them. With the handsome sum derived from the sale of their farm on the Des Moines, they were enabled to purchase an extensive domain of both prairie and woodland. In 10 years they had a model farm, and the story of their successful labors attracted other settlers to their neighborhood. A large price tempted them, and again they disposed of their farm. We have traced genealogically the successive stages in the history of this pioneer family for the purpose of noting, not merely the cheerfulness with which so many generations of daughters accompanied their husbands on their westward march, but the energy which they displayed in making so many homes in the waste places, and preparing the way for the less bold and adventurous class of settlers who follow where the pioneer leads. The family, after disposing of their second Iowa farm, immediately took up their line of march for Nebraska, where they bought and cultivated a large tract of land on one of the tributaries of the Platte. In due time the current of emigration struck them. A favorable offer for their house and cattle ranch was speedily embraced, and again they took up their line of march, which extended this time into the heart of the Rocky Mountains, in Colorado, of which state they were among the earliest settlers. Here Mr. Moody died, but his widow, with her large family, successfully maintained her cattle and sheep ranch till a rich gold mine was discovered upon her land. A sale was soon effected of both the mine and the ranch. In 2 weeks after, the whole family, mother, sons, and daughters, were en route to California, where their long wanderings terminated. There they are now living and enjoying the rich fruits of their energy and enterprise, proving for once the falsity of the proverb that a rolling stone gathers no moss. The women of this family are types of a class, soldiers, scouts, laborers, nurses in the grand army, whose mission it is to reclaim the waste places and conquer uncivilized man. If they fight, it is only for peace and safety. If they destroy, it is only to rebuild nobler structures in the interest of civilization. If they toil and bleed and suffer, it is only that they may rest on their arms, at last, surrounded by honorable and useful trophies, and look forward to ages of home calm which have been secured for their posterity. Chapter 8.